Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Let me thank John for that great introduction. John and Shani have been friends of Iris and mine for decades. I've looked to him for advice in international affairs, issues related to Israel, and I know he's doing a great job over the last year as president of AJC. You're lucky to have John at the helm. Another good friend of mine, Stanley Bergman, was John's predecessor. Harriet Schleifer is now the board chair of the Board of Governors. David Harris is amazing and has done this great job for decades. Thank them all. And a relative, my mishpucha, Milton Cooper, is active through marriage. Would have been nice if I was a direct descendant, but no such luck. And I want to praise him as well. Now, as you know, I always like to start off by telling a story. And this one, some of the New Yorkers have heard it, but most of you have not, so I'll tell this story. It's about, it goes under the category, I've never met you in person. In 1992, I was a congressman, and as I was redistricted from Brooklyn to a district partially in Brooklyn, partially in Queens. I see Nita Lowy here. Hi, Nita. She's heard this story. So I was campaigning in Queens to meet my constituents, and a woman comes over to me and says, "You're Congressman Schumer." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I read in the Queens Tribune you're my new congressman." I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "I'd like to pay you a compliment. I've never met you in person, but I watch C-SPAN religiously, and you have more courage than any other member of Congress." I said, "Well, ma'am, that's a pretty tall statement. There are 435 members of Congress. Some of them are no-goodniks, but most are very estimable people. What makes you say I have more courage than any of the others?" And she said, "Well, look, I watch C-SPAN religiously, even though I haven't met you in person, and every time you rise to your feet to speak, you have the courage to wear a yarmulke." I said, "Thank you very much, ma'am. It's obvious you haven't met me in person. It's not a yarmulke." I love these stories. Do I have time for one more, John? Okay, this is another story. You cannot tell most of these in Ogdensburg. So before an AJC crowd, it's very good. So this was when I was first sworn in as a member of Congress. And my whole family came down and were waiting in the anteroom to be sworn in by then Speaker Tip O'Neill. And my grandmother of blessed memory grabs Tip O'Neill, and as was her wont, I forgot the beginning of it. I haven't told this one in a while. My grandmother, my given name is Charles, but we had an Uncle Charlie on my father's side who my mom didn't like. So she said, if you want to name him Charles, he can't be Charlie, he is Chuck. My mother is tomorrow will turn 89. My dad will turn 94 on Flag Day, knock wood. But in any case, so she always calls me Chucky. Even now, you know, she's follows politics. "Chucky, why aren't you doing more of this?" But my grandmother would always call me Chuckin' you, which I think in Yiddish means little Chucky. I don't know what it means, but that's what I thought. Hope it doesn't mean something worse. In any case, so she grabbed Tip O'Neill, as was her wont, and began to tell them her life story. And she said, "We were born in the little town of Chortkov in Galicia, but the egg business went bad, so we moved to America." But after each little vignette, she'd say, "Take good care of Chuck and you." And she said, and she came to America, and they had no money, and she would walk 3 miles to save a nickel car fare to work in the sweatshops. "Take good care of Chuck and you." She had 3 beautiful sons, she said. They all fought in the war, and none of them ran away, she said. This is what she said, because they were breastfed. Take good care of Chuck and you. And now her grandson is being sworn in, you know, said her son Abe didn't go to college, and her grandson is being sworn in as a congressman of the United States. What a great country we have. Take good care of Chuck and you. Okay. I go out on the floor. I'm sworn in. We go out to dinner and celebrate. The family all goes home, and it's my first day. And I'm sitting at my desk, and I don't really know what to do, and the phone rings. And someone calls up and says, "My name is Leo Deal. Speaker O'Neill wants to see you immediately." I said, "Oh, boy." It was sort of like the first day of school and you're already called into the principal's office. What did I do wrong? So I rush over. I'm in Tip's ante room. My knees are knocking. And finally, Tip, who was a lovely man, comes over to me and says, "Charles, I very much enjoyed meeting your entire family, especially your grandmother. But answer for me one question. What is a Chuck and you, and how do we take care of it?" He thought she was lobbying on some issue or other. Okay. First, on a far more serious note, the horrible, horrible attacks in London over the weekend, another reminder that the global community faces global threats to the values and the principles we've long cherished. We will only be able to confront and ultimately beat back these threats by working together, standing shoulder to shoulder. And the one other point I'd make, the whole world has experienced the horror of terrorism, but 30, 40 years ago, it was only Israel that experienced it. And the rest of the world didn't pay too much attention, and it grew and grew and grew. We can never make that mistake again wherever terrorism rears its ugly head. So first, let me talk about something we're all troubled and worried about, and that is the rising tide of anti-Semitism around the world. It seems that every time we think for a moment we've entered a more enlightened era of tolerance, that age-old demon, anti-Semitism, rears its ugly head again, comes back with a new virulence. Over the past 5 years, we have watched almost with astonishment and disbelief the specter of anti-Semitism rise again in Europe, where it seems to live in the soil as their original sin. I once expressed to the president, I was talking about our disagreement on the Iran deal, and one of my objections was that the Europeans had too much say. And I sort of explained to him that it's sort of deep in the bones in too much of Europe to be anti-Semitic, and it leads to a lack of sympathy for Israel. Now we have seen neo-Nazi gangs in the streets of European capitals, far-right politicians running on platforms that openly promote hostility towards Jews and other religious minorities. And European Jews these days don't feel safe sending their children to Jewish day schools, buying groceries at the local kosher market, going to synagogue on Shabbat. The rise of anti-Semitism in Europe is an outrage. It ought to be condemned by the leaders of the world and of every faith and every nationality. Anti-Semitism always simmered just a bit beneath the surface in Europe, as I mentioned. It's been far more troubling to see that scourge emerge in America in recent months. Earlier this year, it felt like almost every day we saw new reports of synagogues graffitied with swastikas, Jewish cemeteries vandalized, desecrated, and waves of bomb threats to our Jewish community centers and day schools. It seems the darkest, most hateful fringes of our society, from the far right to the far left, have become newly emboldened. We simply cannot stand for this. We have to continue to bring the perpetrators of these heinous acts to swift justice. We must continue to speak out and show those who traffic in hatred and bigotry that we will not abide. And I really want to compliment AJC. You've been tireless on this front. Your initiatives like Mayors United Against Anti-Semitism, the Muslim Jewish Advisory Council, launched by AJC and the Islamic Society of North America. I had a meeting with the council leaders earlier this year. It was just great. Shows what we must do. Together, join together, and fight back against all forms of hate. I've worked hard to push the federal government to do everything in its power to combat these threats. wherever they may arise. In March, at my urging, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, announced that Jewish community centers and other at-risk organizations had been granted special emergency waivers that make it much easier for law enforcement to access caller ID information, to track down and prosecute these criminals. Technology allows them to hide it, but law enforcement has the tools to get behind it. The FCC had to give them permission. Just recently, Congress allocated $25 million for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which provides nonprofits and religious organizations with the resources for emergency preparedness. The money saves lives, I'm proud to say, bipartisan. We increased the funding this year to new highs. Nita Lowey played a big role in that as well. International efforts by groups like you, continued leadership from the United States is the only thing we have, but it works to extinguish this hatred. We just have to keep working diligently. We can't give up. We can't shrug our shoulders. We have to keep working. On BDS, John mentioned the great ad that I read this morning on the shuttle coming down that was a culmination of a great deal of hard work of what you have done. Now, the vile attacks I mentioned before are so despicable and they're motivated by hate. The anti-Semitic aspect can't be ignored. But sometimes anti-Semitism is cloaked, hidden by certain movements that profess no bias, but suspiciously hold Israel and by extension the Jewish people to a different standard than others. There's no greater example than this insidious effort to harm the Jewish state than through the boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. The global BDS movement is a deeply biased campaign aimed at delegitimizing the Jewish state, and its supporters, sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly, but all of them practice a modern form of anti-Semitism. And we have to call them out for that. I want to tell you a little story. When I was a college student, the SDS, which was the sort of left-wing radical movement, but it switched. It's moved from free love and smoke pot and have hair down to your shoulders and all that stuff. Wear bell-bottoms. Anyone here remember what bell-bottoms were? They're probably coming back and I didn't even notice, but anyway, they switched and they were taken over by a hardcore group. And one of their campaigns was against the state of Israel. There shouldn't be a Jewish state. It's Zionist imperialism. And so I was active in both the Harvard Young Democrats and in Hillel, and we invited Abba Eban to come speak. And 2,000 people gathered in the big auditorium there called Sanders Theater, and the SDS PLP was in the balcony, and they had their banners, Stop Zionist Imperialism, Free Palestine, whatever. Eban, in his Etonian tones, which I will not try to imitate at the request of my staff. I would love to do it. John was right, what he said. But he pointed to them, and he said, I want to tell you something, you up there in the balcony. I said, for centuries, there has been a double standard that affects Jews. The Jew was allowed to be a farmer. No, a Jew was not allowed to be a farmer. Everyone else was. The Jew could not live in Moscow. Everyone else could. The Jew could not do this, that, or the other thing. And he said, you, in the balcony, when every other people gains their nationhood, you applaud. And he named a few countries, I think. When Sri Lanka or Zambia or Paraguay becomes an independent country, you applaud. There is only one group of people that you criticize, that you attack when they become a nation, and that is the state of Israel. You, he said, are anti-Semites. They slinked away, they picked up their banners, and never in the last few years that I was at college did the SDS-PLP attack Israel again. That kind of calling out BDS for what it is very, very important, because the double standard exists today with them. BDS condemns Israel. They seek to impose boycotts solely on the Jewish state, but willfully turn a blind eye to nations that actually violate human rights. When Iran sponsors terror and executes dissenters, BDS is quiet. When Arab nations jail journalists, punish homosexuality with prison sentences and physical abuse, BDS is nowhere to be found. And that's because the state of Israel is all too frequently measured by a different double standard than the rest of the world. It's up to us to fight these efforts tooth and nail. They're not only unjust and immoral, they're counterproductive in achieving a truly lasting peace between Israel and the Palestinians. So again, you deserve a huge round of applause for what you did with the governors. Our state of New York has passed a law that says if your business or university boycotts Israel, then New York will boycott you. Just last week, Nevada did the same. We should call on every governor of every state to pass the same exact law. On the 50th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem, let's be clear that many BDS supporters have the same goal as the armies that amassed on Israel's border to annihilate the Jewish state. But make no mistake, as we defeated them, the BDS supporters will be defeated as well. Another place where cloaked anti-Semitism lurks is in the halls of the United Nations. The UN singles out Israel more than any other nation, especially in the Human Rights Council, which remains hell-bent on admonishing the only beachhead of democracy and representative government and equal rights in the Middle East. I was heartened to hear the new Secretary General recently say he would be on the front lines in the fight against anti-Semitism. He proclaimed that Israel must be treated as any other state in the UN. And just last week, Danny Danon was elected Vice President of the 72nd session of the UN General Assembly. That's progress. AJC played a role in that as well. And your continued engagement as a group with UN officials in Turtle Bay is very important. At the UN, we can never let our guard down. Since the days of Zionism is racism, the UN has been an incubator for Israel bashing, a forum where Israel is almost always the villain and never the victim. We should all be wary of it. I hope that one day it'll happen. Israel will come to be treated fairly in the UN. But until that day comes, the US must always come to the aid of our friend Israel at the UN. It must continue to serve as a bulwark against smear campaigns and efforts to isolate Israel. We can't be silent when the UN singles Israel out for condemnation. The United States should have vetoed Resolution 2334 in December, and it should never use the United Nations as a forum to put pressure on Israel of any kind. Iran. Finally, an engaged America is particularly important when it comes to Iran, which continues to sow instability throughout the region. The regime continues to provide support to its proxies in the region, conduct ballistic missile tests, flagrantly abuse the human rights of its own people, and unjustly imprison foreigners. We must work with our partners in the region to counter Iran's malign activities, and especially hold their feet to the fire on compliance with JCPOA. As John mentioned earlier, I didn't support it, but it passed. I don't think we should now violate this agreement. We should be in watchful waiting to see what happens. It is, however, incumbent upon us to remain vigilant and watch Iran like a hawk outside of the JCPOA. Their provocative missile tests, their sponsorship of terrorism, their human rights abuses are outrageous. It is imperative in the Congress we act in a bipartisan way to counter this behavior and keep that regime in check. My friends, the challenges before us are great. Anti-Semitism at home and abroad, nefarious campaigns leveled against Israel at the UN and in the form of the BDS movement, calls for a new brand of isolationism that would leave the United States less able to confront and combat each of those threats and many more beside. The only way we can protect the progress we've made, defend our friends and allies, including Israel, and continue to work towards a more peaceful and prosperous world is if America leads. When the world cannot trust America to live up to its commitments, that unsettles our allies and emboldens our adversaries. When America does not stand up for human rights and democratic principles beyond our borders, that weakens our fidelity to those values within our borders. The world has been a better place, my friends, when America is a beacon for freedom and tolerance, when people around the world continue to look up to the lady who holds the torch in the harbor in the city in which I live, when economic and social advancement is a goal for all peoples. America has always been a better country when we embrace that role. What would it mean for Israel and the Jewish people were the U.S. to retreat, to look inward, and disengage from a world that's ever more interconnected and interdependent? The challenges we face will not go away if America closes her eyes for the next 4 years. They'll still be there when she opens them, and they will have grown immensely. So the best thing, I say to you with complete conviction, the best thing for Israel and for Jews world over is a strong, engaged America on the world stage. We must work to keep it that way. Well, the late Shimon Peres once called AJC the foreign ministry of the Jewish people. Your founders believed the Jewish people needed to be masters of their own destiny, no matter where they lived. So they worked hard to engage the world, to forge new relationships, to build bonds with nations and communities worldwide. And they did this while promoting the virtues of pluralism, democracy, human rights for Jews and non-Jews alike. In the spirit of your founders more than a century ago, AJC knows this type of global engagement is the only way to ensure true progress. Today, this approach and your mission are more important than ever. Together, let's continue to make sure America engages the world and fights intolerance wherever it arises. Let's make sure America continues to lead for the sake of the values and the principles we all hold so dear. Thank you, and keep up the good work, everybody.